Watch out! Natsia grabbed Mateen's arm and pulled him back as the brightly painted bus squealed past them and came to a stop along the main road near the cricket pitch. The decorative trim that hung from the window flashed under the too bright sun and jangled together, the metallic sound competing with the Indian pop music that blared from the driver's cassette player. Natsia handed off her whimpering brother to Amma. Natsia had snapped at him louder than she needed to, but the fear of the unknown put her on edge. Malia had walked to the bus stop with them, and Natsia had been struggling to hold back the turmoil within her. She didn't want her best friend to know how afraid she really was, but Malia already knew. Don't worry, Natsia. Hisham and I will talk to our mother. Maybe she and Abu will find some place for you so you won't have to go. And you know our parents insist that you stay with us if you don't find a place. Even if your mother is too full of pride to listen, you must convince her. Our home will always be open to you. Natsia nodded, fighting desperately to hold back the tears. She clung to Malia for a second longer before pulling away. I know, Malia, you're the greatest friend ever. The bus driver blasted his horn in a final warning. Natsia reached inside her backpack, pulled out a folded scrap of paper, and stuffed it into Malia's hand. Keep this safe. Give it to Abu when he returns. Natsia followed the surge of women toward the bus, craning her neck to keep Amma in her sight just ahead as she climbed the steep steps. The attendant lifted Isha and Mateen aboard, and they settled onto a bench near the driver. Natsia remained standing and held on to the back of the driver's seat for support as the bus jerked into motion. Through the open window, she watched Malia waving goodbye and getting smaller and smaller as they pulled away. Within seconds, her friend was gone, lost in the chaos of constant traffic. Amma pulled Mateen close to her when the bus started rolling, the swaying motion forcing the passengers to lean hard against one another at every curve in the road. Natsia gripped the seat and glanced around at the other women. Where were they headed? Most were wearing the black hijab that covers the length of the body, revealing only their faces and their hands. Others sat with their dupattas sliding down their heads, eyes open but cast downward, and lost in a dreamland from the moment they took their seats. The ride was short, less than 10 minutes. Natsia soaked in the view of the busy market until the bus lurched to a stop in front of the meat stall where they had met Shanaz almost a month ago. She got off the bus, helped her family, then headed down the narrow alleyway where cars were parked haphazardly alongside storefronts and beggars were already making the rounds. When they reached Seema's house, Shirzad was already by the gate with the door swinging open before Amma could ring the buzzer. Assalamu alaikum, he stood rigidly, saluting as they entered. Amma hurried silently toward the house with Isha and Mateen. Walaikum assalam, Natsia brushed past him, suddenly cringing as she realized she had forgotten to bring the boy the extra food she had promised. You're here early, Shirzad said. He walked up alongside Natsia up the driveway and around the house to the kitchen entrance, his arms swinging loosely. Amma's going to ask Baji for a place to stay. Shirzad's eyes widened. Really? The memory of last night bubbled up inside her. Natsia explained what had happened. Don't you have relatives in Karachi? Shirzad asked. She thought of her uncle. No, no relatives in Karachi. My uncle lives in Punjab. What about your father? Shirzad stopped at the door while Natsia removed her slippers and Amma settled Isha and Mateen on the veranda. We haven't seen him for 2 days. Where was he? What if he was lying somewhere injured and helpless? Or he had found a job where they hired him right away and he couldn't leave work to tell them he was okay? Or was he just like her brother and her uncle? Did he run away just when they needed him too? She couldn't let herself believe that. Not yet. Amma climbed up the stairs and into the kitchen. Inside, Natsia, she called. Natsia followed her mother into the lounge where Seema sat on a sagging chair with her back to the kitchen, watching a cooking show on PTV. On the screen, a tall Indian man with a pointy mustache diced an onion and scraped it into a steel pot, all the while moving his chef's knife floridly in the air. When Amma called out a greeting, Seema lifted a hand in acknowledgement. Amma put a finger to her lips and motioned for Natsia to follow her. They sat on the floor. Amma and Seema talked about the weather and the price of eggs and bread. Seema was hunched in her chair. Her clothes looked wrinkled and slept in, and clumps of jet black hair hung loosely around her face, free from the plastic hair clip that held the remaining locks in. She sipped tea from a chipped porcelain cup, and the heady aroma made Natsia's stomach tighten. Malia's mother had offered them rice and paratha for breakfast. The flatbread fried in ghee was devoured quickly, but there hadn't been nearly enough to satisfy the stomachs of two families. The onions cooking on the screen were joined by a dash of salt, chili powder, ginger, and garlic, and Natsia's mouth began to water. "Why are you here so early?" Seema rested the cup on the arm of her chair. Amma launched into the events of the past 2 days. Seema's eyebrows rose at the part where Uncle Tariq had called off the engagement when Abu never showed up. "So what will you do now?" "Our place is occupied, and they've taken our furniture, our beds. We have only a few bags and some kitchen items, which we left at a neighbor's." Amma glanced at Natsia and licked her lips, then placed a hand on Seema's foot. "You have empty rooms. We need only one since the men are gone. We won't cause you any trouble. We could help you in the evenings, whatever you like. Shirzad sleeps by the gate, and the back quarters are empty. We could clean them out, and you won't even notice we are here. Please, Baji, let us stay here with you." "Won't notice you're here, eh?" Seema chuckled. "What about all the meals? Now I only give you and the girl lunch. If you stay, then you'll want breakfast, lunch, tea, and dinner. Who can pay for that?" Natsia wondered the same, given how hungry Shirzad always was. How could there possibly be enough for all of them? Amma squeezed Seema's foot, then released it to clasp her hands together. "Baji, please, we won't eat much. We'll still have the money from cleaning houses." Seema stared thoughtfully at the TV and finished her tea. The chef had added yogurt and plump pieces of chicken to the curry, which was now bubbling over a low flame. Natsia pressed her arms around herself to keep her stomach from grumbling. "What about your husband?" Seema asked finally. "What would you do if he returns?" "He won't," Amma said quickly. "He's been gone for 2 days, and he doesn't know where we work." Natsia shifted uncomfortably, knowing that Malia kept a folded scrap of paper in her backpack to give to Abu if she ever saw him, the address of Seema's house written in careful Urdu in Natsia's own handwriting. "What about your son, then? You always said he'd return to you." Amma groaned. "My son, my husband, my brother-in-law, all the men in our family are the same. I don't know why. I guess I'll never understand it, but that's just the way it is for people like us." "Yes," Seema agreed. "Look at Shanaz. Her husband is just as worthless, but she is not bound to him by children. Why would the lazy brutes get a job when they know they can live off the hard work of a woman?" Natsia opened her mouth but closed it. There would be no use in defending Abu right now. No matter what Amma or Seema thought, Natsia knew that finding a place to stay was more important, even if that meant Amma had to badmouth Abu. "Of course! They know our women will go to any lengths to feed their children. The men know this all too well and use it against us. They suck the joy from our marrow, like leeches." Natsia turned sharply to look at her mother. Was it really that bad for her? Was Amma so unhappy with Abu? Or was she only making a case for a place to stay? She tried to catch her mother's eye, but Amma refused to look at her. Seema stood and pulled at her gauze-thin shalwar kameez. "You can stay, but if your son shows up, or even your husband, they are not welcome." She picked up her teacup and headed to the kitchen. "Come, I'll show you your room." Why couldn't Amma hold her tongue? When Amma motioned at her to get up, Natsia stood up hastily and tried not to pout. At least they had a place to stay. She knew Amma would want her to be grateful for that, so she bit the inside of her lip, grabbed her mother's arm, and squeezed it gently. Outside, the sun was hot on the concrete that surrounded the house, and only a portion of the veranda offered shade. Mateen and Isha were lying limp on the terrace, the cool marble beneath them the only solace from the heat. Seema stopped and waved a hand at them. "They'll look like dried up raisins if they stay here." "Uto!" Amma shouted at them. "Get up!" Amma grabbed Isha's arm and dragged her away across the smooth flooring to the shade of the concrete awning. A film of dust was swept along by the trailing end of Isha's cotton kameez. Natsia pulled Mateen to rest alongside his sister, and her heart ached for him when he didn't even bother to open his eyes at the movement. "Senseless kids," Amma grumbled. "Don't even have the brains to move into the shade." "They're tired and hungry," Natsia snapped. Seema walked toward the back of the house. A row of concrete brick shacks was built against the property wall, consisting of 4 rooms. The doors were made of slats nailed together, the wood old and weathered, with strips of blue paint still visible. Seema positioned her shoulder against the first door and gave it a hard shove. The wood had expanded from years of heat and neglect, and it scraped roughly against the ground as it opened. The sunlight cut into the depths of the putrid-smelling room, and dust swirled in the air. Natsia and her mother waited outside while Seema ducked her head and entered. With one hand on her hip and the other pressing her dupatta against her mouth, she took in the dilapidated condition of the servant quarters. "We haven't had a servant living in here in ages," she said, almost apologetically. She looked around for a moment, then stepped back out into the sun and shook the dust from her dupatta. "Well, it needs work. You can clean it up when you're done with the house. It has 2 sharpais, should be enough if you sleep 2 per bed. The servants' bathroom is at the end of the row down there. I'm sure it needs cleaning, too." Amma began a shower of thanks and blessed Seema for her kindness. "Well, don't be too quick in your thanks, Nasim," Seema warned. "I'm not finished. Leave these 2 middle rooms alone. Sahib is using them for storage. As for food and rent, you'll get all your meals, even the children, but you'll have to forfeit the income from cleaning my house. You can still work and keep the money from the other houses, but in the evenings you'll need to help out here." Amma must have known that she'd be asked to give up the income from Seema's house, because she didn't raise a single protest. Natsia wondered fleetingly if there would be any money left over to rebuild her dowry. "It will be nice to have live-in servants again," Seema smiled. "Baji, but you have Shirzad." "Oh, he's just a boy. He can't do everything." Amma chuckled. "Don't worry, Baji. You'll be happy with us. I promise you." Seema waved her away. "Fine, fine. I have some things you can use. Old sheets, clothes, dishes. I'll sort through my things while you're working." After Seema went back inside, Amma gave Natsia a hug. "See that? Allah is on our side." Natsia wondered if her prayer had helped. She wrestled out of her mother's gasp. "What about Abu?" A frown flashed across Amma's face, but was gone just as quickly. "He can take care of himself. Where was he when Iqbal threw us out on the street? Where was he when his brother broke off your marriage? He'll fend for himself. I've come to realize that Bilal and your father are the same. I didn't want to believe it, but I'm not blind, you know. I see that we are alone. I see that I am carrying this family all alone." So Amma was giving up on Abu. A part of Natsia understood Amma's willingness to abandon Abu, but another part of her struggled to change Amma's mind. Everything would always be so much harder for them without Abu. Why couldn't Amma see that? Was she willing to struggle the rest of her life? Whether Amma believed it or not, they needed Abu. Natsia realized that she was the only one who still believed in him and decided that from now on she'd keep her faith in Abu to herself. She didn't want to hurt Amma, but she couldn't abandon Abu so easily. "Not all alone, Amma," Natsia's voice softened. "I'm here. I'm helping too, aren't I?" Amma cupped her daughter's face in her hands. "Yes, Beta, you are always here to help me. A daughter is worth 100 sons, no matter what the rest of the world says. Come now, let's get to work." By nightfall, the air was still, and heat clung like a wet towel against Natsia's skin. She had pulled a sharpai from her quarters and positioned it on the narrow passageway between the main house and the boundary wall in hopes of resting in the steady breeze that came from the sea. Except for the drone of the neighbor's generator to combat the blackouts caused by load shedding, the air was still. The electricity had gone out immediately after Kabarnama, the evening news. Natsia supposed the temporary blackouts were planned and announced in newspapers. But since her mother rarely had the money to spare on a newspaper, the electrical outages were always an unwelcome surprise. Seema and the Sahib had gone to Clifton Beach for the evening to escape the stifling heat. Only Shirzad sat outside the front gate guarding the house. "Sit still, Isha." Natsia gathered her sister's hair in one hand and ran a comb through the oiled mass to smooth out the tangles before she braided it. "You're hurting me." Isha tried to pull away. Natsia gave her sister's hair a quick jerk. "If you don't stop moving, I'm going to tell Amma and she'll cut it all off." Isha leaped off the sharpai, then whirled back to look at Natsia. "And I'm going to tell Amma that you're hurting me on purpose." She covered her mouth with shaky fingers. Natsia immediately felt sorry. Well, don't cry about it. She held out her arms. Come back and let me finish. I promise I'll be gentle.